la Facultad de Información de la Universidad de California, Berkeley. Es una de las universidades más prestigiosas del mundo, con una gran trayectoria, especialmente en vinculación, en todo lo que hace o concierne a uno de los distritos más dinámicos del mundo de desarrollo emprendedor, que es Silicon Valley. Es para nosotros, a su vez, una oportunidad única en términos de desarrollo de uno de los objetivos fundacionales de la universidad, que es el desarrollo de tecnologías, el desarrollo de innovación y el desarrollo de factores que conduzcan a la mejora de la competitividad de la región. Nosotros estamos completamente consustanciados de la necesidad, por un lado, de acercar la universidad a las mejores prácticas en la materia, pero al mismo tiempo en el desafío de poder decidir cuáles son los senderos por los cuales se va a desarrollar la oferta académica y de investigación de la Universidad Nacional de Rafaela. Entendemos que en esta era de la globalización hay ciertos factores críticos, como es pensar en la nueva revolución industrial o la industria 4.0, la influencia a su vez de la interconectividad, de las relaciones que en el pasado se daban a nivel de un territorio y de las relaciones que luego se transitan a través de una nueva geografía que obviamente no se compadece con la tradicional geografía que conocíamos a nivel de los territorios, de las naciones, de los continentes. Creo que entender y poder captar las enseñanzas de este tipo de experiencias de universidades vinculadas a áreas que en poco tiempo se han desarrollado con una gran dinámica y a su vez con una diversidad de elementos donde el factor tecnológico se ha transformado en la clave del desarrollo, junto con una serie de condicionantes que hacen al entorno y a su vez que hacen también a las instituciones que conforman ese entorno y que permiten el desarrollo más virtuoso y más eficiente de cualquier tipo de emprendimiento. Es por eso que a nosotros nos parece que la Universidad de Rafaela tiene que vincular el desarrollo de ofertas académicas tradicionales con materias de investigación que tengan impacto en el corto y en el mediano plazo en la sociedad y que a su vez nos permitan fomentar o desarrollar una autopista de vinculaciones a nivel internacional y de esa manera poder estar a la altura de las circunstancias si pensamos que estamos tratando de desarrollar ventajas competitivas que permitan a su vez también trascender el mero hecho de producir commodities y el mero hecho de poder exportar a nivel internacional. Sabemos que Argentina es un país con una economía emergente y que está basada claramente en la producción eficiente de una determinada serie de bienes y servicios, y es necesario a su vez dotarla, en particular a nuestra región, de algunas ventajas que de alguna manera se acerquen a una economía más dirigida por factores tecnológicos e innovativos. Y cuando digo tecnológico, digo la manera en que se pueden desarrollar nuevas formas de producir más que grandes innovaciones radicales que por ahí tomamos como ejemplo. Creo que una de las tareas que vamos a desarrollar pronto es la difusión de buenos ejemplos, efectos de demostración a nivel local que permitan contrastar lo que se pudo hacer en el pasado y lo que claramente uno mira en términos de perspectiva, lo que puede ser dentro de 20 o 30 años a partir de ahora. Así que, dicho esto, le dejo la palabra a AnnaLee Saxenian para su presentación. Muchas gracias.
Y bueno, queremos darle la bienvenida a todos a esta actividad, la UNRaf, que fue creada el 3 de diciembre de 2014 mediante la ley número 27.062, sancionada por unanimidad en el Senado de la Nación y promulgada el 23 de diciembre de ese mismo año, según el proyecto de ley presentado por el entonces diputado nacional por la provincia de Santa Fe, contador público nacional Omar Perotti. Una vez más, agradecemos la presencia para compartir un nuevo encuentro con referentes de amplia y reconocida trayectoria en diversas temáticas de interés académico y de actividad. Estas propuestas son parte de nuestra identidad institucional. Somos una universidad pública con eje en la innovación, la competitividad y el desarrollo fuertemente ligado al territorio, que trabaja permanentemente para fortalecer su vínculo con la comunidad a través del conocimiento. De este modo, buscamos generar nuevos espacios de aprendizaje, debate y reflexión que complementan nuestra actividad en las aulas y nos proyecta hacia toda la región, el país y el mundo. Hoy nos complace presentar la charla Pequeñas y Medianas Empresas, Innovación en la Economía Global, a cargo de la doctora AnnaLee Saxenian, decana de la Facultad de Información de la Universidad de California en Berkeley, Estados Unidos, a quien, por supuesto, recibimos afectuosamente con un aplauso. AnnaLee es doctora en Ciencias Políticas por el prestigioso Massachusetts Institute of Technology, máster en Planificación Regional por la Universidad de California en Berkeley y licenciada en Economía por Williams College. Sus estudios se centran en las economías regionales y en las condiciones bajo las cuales las personas, las ideas y la geografía se combinan y conectan en ejes de actividad económica. Es miembro de la Junta Asesora Académica de Apple y autora del libro internacionalmente reconocido titulado Ventaja Regional, Cultura y Competencia en Silicon Valley y Ruta 128, en el que aborda la experiencia de Silicon Valley a través del estudio de sus estructuras industriales y sociales que propician la innovación a nivel global. Sus proyectos más recientes se enfocan en el desarrollo de las industrias de tecnología de la información en Finlandia. Por otro lado, tenemos que agradecer al Instituto Superior del Profesorado número 2, Joaquín V. González, por recibirnos en este distinguido auditorio Virgilio Cordero y por la permanente colaboración que brinda nuestra universidad, acompañando su crecimiento institucional. También pido un aplauso para el Instituto del Profesorado. Se encuentran presentes hoy el senador nacional por la provincia de Santa Fe, contador público nacional Omar Perotti, el señor intendente municipal, arquitecto Luis Castellano, quien además ha entregado una misiva, por la cual, señor intendente, voy a hacer cargo de leerla. Dice y agradece la invitación a participar de la charla pública Pequeñas y Medianas Empresas, Innovación en la Economía Global, a cargo de la prestigiosa doctora AnnaLee Saxenian. La importancia de promover la innovación en las pequeñas y medianas empresas de la ciudad y la región mejora la competitividad de nuestro entramado productivo y así contribuye al desarrollo económico local. Ser innovadores, no solo desde un punto de vista tecnológico, sino teniendo en cuenta las nuevas formas de gestión, del hacer, brindando nuevos servicios, adaptándose a las exigencias de los consumidores de hoy. En la persona del doctor Rubén Ajúa acerca sus felicitaciones por esta iniciativa, que los ciudadanos podrán disfrutar, deseándoles a todos una exitosa concurrencia. Un cordial saludo extensivo a todos los presentes de parte del intendente. También agradecemos la presencia del senador nacional por la provincia de Santa Fe, tal cual lo decíamos, el contador Omar Perotti, senador provincial por el departamento Castellanos, Alcides Calvo, gracias a la presencia del señor diputado provincial, licenciado Roberto Mirabella, señoras y señores concejales de la ciudad, también nos acompañan miembros integrantes del Consejo Universitario de Rafaela, miembros del Gabinete Municipal, dirigentes de diversas y prestigiosas instituciones de la ciudad de Rafaela. Y como siempre, agradecemos también el respaldo y el compromiso de nuestros estimados docentes, no docentes y estudiantes de las 6 licenciaturas de la Universidad de Rafaela, la UNRaf. Hacemos extensivo este agradecimiento a las comunidades educativas de otras universidades e institutos de la región que nos acompañan. A todos, bienvenidos. También saludamos a los periodistas en medios de prensa, valoramos y agradecemos mucho su cobertura profesional. Ahora sí, estamos listos para comenzar esta charla, Pequeñas y Medianas Empresas, Innovación en la Economía Global. Adelante, muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Should that be echoing so loud? It's too loud. Is that okay? No. It's okay. Okay. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm very, very pleased to be in Argentina, and especially pleased to be in Rafaela. This is my second visit to Rafaela. I was here 5 years ago, and it seems this time even more beautiful and more affluent and more dynamic than it was before. I want to especially thank Ruben Asquia, Maria Julia, Fernando, and all of the other people at Universidad Nacional of Rafaela who have helped me today in a wonderful visit. So, I forgot the thing. I'm going to talk about my research on Silicon Valley. This is research that I've been working on for many years, decades. But maybe I need to be closer. I think maybe I need to be closer. Do I need to be closer to that in order for it to work? Yeah, perfect. Okay, thank you. Okay, today's plan. I'm going to talk about two research findings. The first is the shift we've seen in my lifetime, and many of your lifetimes, from the self-sufficient large corporation as the model of economic development to regional ecosystems of small and medium-sized firms like Silicon Valley. And the second research finding is the importance of local and global networks to supporting innovative recombination in regions like this. And then I'll offer 4 policy lessons for places that are curious to learn from Silicon Valley. Okay, this is a picture of the headquarters of General Motors, the biggest American corporation in the post-war period. General Motors came to symbolize American mass production in the post-war period. They cranked out millions of cars annually. This company and this model, this corporate model, was characterized by large hierarchical corporations, vertical integration, which means they produced virtually everything internally. So, for example, General Motors not only made the components and assembled the cars, but also had sheep farms for the car seats, or they had timber. They had many associated activities because the idea was to control everything that went into production. Typically, this mass production company engaged in very long-term planning. You could have 5 or even 10-year plans for production, for output, for investment. And careers were conducted largely within the same firm. So for a young person graduating from college, the ideal career was to start at the bottom of one of these big companies and spend your lifetime in that company. And that was associated with a strong amount of corporate loyalty. The company was like the family. Okay. Research in this model happened outside of the operations of the firm. Research, this is a picture of the R&D lab of Bell Laboratories, AT&T Bell Labs. It was isolated in New Jersey, in a beautiful area. So there was a radical separation of research and then production. Research was the beginning of the process, and then lessons from research were thrown over to engineers and then to operators and people who produced the cars. In some sense, research was the corporate brain, and it was separated from execution, which was production. Now, this was associated, of course, with very predictable product life cycles, long-term cycles of investment and planning and output, and a linear process of innovation. What's the new model? That's the old model. I'm going to learn this, don't worry. I've got it upside down. I'm not. Okay, Silicon Valley, this is the new model. The new model looks different in many ways. The new model is organized not around a single firm, but around a region and an ecosystem. It is characterized by high rates of new firm formation, entrepreneurship, ongoing experimentation, experiments with new technologies, new products, new business models. The boundaries between firms are very open. People move frequently from firm to firm, so rather than having a career in one big corporation, somebody's career might involve moving multiple times between companies. The advantage of this system is that information flows horizontally across the firms and other institutions, and that because information flows openly, learning happens much more quickly. So you have a continuous circulation of ideas and of learning. Learning often happens through failure. So this is one of the big changes, whereas in the old model, failure was always avoided. In this model, it's okay to fail, it's fine to fail. Failure is seen as a way of learning. So there's a lot of trial and error, there's no stigma, and mistakes become ways of learning. Also, serendipity is very important. The unplanned meeting of people between firms often leads to new innovation. The trust that grows from face-to-face interaction repeatedly. The role models, the existence of role models, people who maybe were former classmates who went and started a company and were successful, become role models for the next generation. And the final feature I have here, resilience. Because this system is so decentralized, the failure of any one firm or even an industry, a sector, doesn't destroy the whole regional economy. So in the old model, when General Motors fell into crisis, the whole region went into crisis. In this region, in the 1980s, the semiconductor industry fell into crisis. Japanese producers were more competitive than American producers. They did higher value, higher quality production. That many thousands of jobs were lost, but the region itself adapted. People lost jobs, but they started new firms. So this system, its decentralization, gives it tremendous adaptive capacity. There. So one of the most important lessons about Silicon Valley is that it was not a planned. Nobody planned Silicon Valley. It was the outcome of many, many different decisions at different times that have contributed to a very virtuous cycle of entrepreneurship and innovation and investment. But I'm going to just point out a few of the institutional underpinnings that I think have made a difference over the past 5 or 6 decades to the evolution of Silicon Valley. Let me start by saying in 1950s, even early 1960s, the region that we now call Silicon Valley was just an agricultural region. It was one of the world's largest exporters of prunes and apricots. So really, it was the Second World War that really triggered some of the most important changes in the regional economy. And in the Second World War, and more importantly, in the post-war period, there was a tremendous amount of funding for universities and some companies for Cold War research, technological research. And that research funding provided some of the technological basis for the early innovations. Often overlooked, the state of California in the 1950s and 60s invested very heavily in the roads and the physical infrastructure, but also created a very innovative system of higher education. California has a system of 3 tiers of higher education: community colleges, state universities, and then the research universities, the University of California. Those investments created a really positive environment for which innovation could happen. They didn't cause it, but that was a really permissive investment, so those are very important. Over time, we've seen the evolution of a financial ecosystem that supports startups, and this initially, I'll come back to this, initially it was simply the first few entrepreneurs who made a lot of money invested it in their friends' ventures. So venture capital was indigenous, it grew locally. Over time it's been institutionalized and also evolved in many, many different ways. There's a legal component. I just point this out because many people believe this is one of the most important features. I don't think it's maybe necessary, but certainly not sufficient. Companies, the courts in California will not enforce non-compete. A non-compete agreement is when I say to you, you're my employee, you cannot go and work for a competing firm. I disallow that. So no courts will allow that. But in other parts of the US, companies make their employees sign that agreement. And it's very detrimental to innovation. It slows down innovation dramatically. I think also really important is this culture that emerged in Silicon Valley in the 60s, 50s, 60s, 70s, that are called the culture of openness. And I like to talk about this as growing. This is the founding myth of Silicon Valley. The genealogy, this genealogy historically was a poster. When I started doing research, it was a poster that hung on the walls of many Silicon Valley entrepreneurial companies. And essentially it traces the formation of the first semiconductor companies out of one company. So in 1956, 8 of the top engineers from Shockley Semiconductor left to start something called Fairchild Semiconductor. They were called the traitorous 8 because they left. It was at that time, it was traitorous to leave a company. But they all left. They started Fairchild Semiconductor. And then virtually every one of them left in subsequent decades to start a new company. So this model of joining a company for a short period and then starting something new became a pattern that very much shaped the culture of the regional valley. But by the time that Robert Noyce, Andy Grove, and Gordon Moore left and started what we now know as Intel Corporation in 1968, by that time, already over 125 companies had been started in Silicon Valley. So this is just a very early glimpse of the spin-offs from that one company. So you can now look and see the genealogy of spin-offs from, say, from Hewlett-Packard or from PayPal or many different companies. So, in fact, in the early days, the engineers would say, I work for Silicon Valley. So, in fact, they didn't think they worked for a company. They worked for the regional economy. They thought they were advancing technology rather than any single company. And I think that reflects the deeper understanding that individuals and firms don't create success on their own. They create it as part of communities across a region that depend on other sources of information, of services and whatnot. Okay, so let's now look to the current period. Well, this is a chart showing in the 1990s the rate of startups. And the point in this slide and the next one is to show just how many companies are started in the Valley every year. So you can see in 1990, about 5,000 companies were started, new companies, and about almost 10,000 closed. Oh, thank you. And then over the course of the decade, what you see is some years You know, in 1992, 25,000 new firms were started, and only less than 5,000 went out of business. But then in '94, there were a lot of closures. So this is a very turbulent ecosystem. So over the course of the entire decade of the 1990s, over 29,000 companies were started, but only 1/4 had more than 5 employees. So the majority of these companies stay very, very small. Brings us up to date, and what you see is that the same entrepreneurial churn continues. So 10,000 new startups in 1995. In 2011, 60,000. Okay, a huge number of startups. The majority of those fail. And so it's a continual churn. It's just people trying new things continually. Lots of experiments, lots of failures, and a few successes. I think the point is that startups and small firms collectively represent a major force in the dynamics of the regional economy. So how does this work, this thousands of companies in a region? One of the most important elements of the ecosystem is a set of local social networks, professional networks, allow for information change and learning. So people meet one another and they find co-founders, they learn to what's going on in the industry through these networks. So I can identify, for example, IEEE, that's the Engineering Association. These are ethnic. This is the Chinese Institute of Engineers. This is the Indus Entrepreneurs, which was started by Indian entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley. The Technion Society is Israelis. Venture capital has become a very important network within the Valley. These are, again, this metaphor of decentralization and then very powerful horizontal networks connecting individuals and companies over time. I'll just comment on a couple more features that have evolved over time. One thing to say is that this is by no means a static system. The economy continues to evolve technologically. The business models change. The type of firm exchange. One of the biggest changes that I've observed is the rise of immigrants within the Valley. So you can see in Silicon Valley, 40%, almost 40, 37.5% of the population is foreign-born. So that's first-generation immigrants. If you look at the engineering workforce, the proportion that are first-generation immigrants is more like 50%. Huge. Silicon Valley has continued, in its early years, it absorbed engineers from all over the US. And since the 1990s, it has been absorbing immigrants from Europe, Latin America, Asia, Africa, Middle East. And just see that it's 37.5% in the Valley. In the US as a whole, the immigrant population is only 13%. So this is one of the most dramatic differences between this region and other parts of the US. So just like the boundaries between firms are open, the external boundaries are open. Anybody who comes and who has the necessary skill can integrate into this workforce. It also absorbs highly educated workers. So you can see Silicon Valley and San Francisco, which are really the same region now. About 50% of the population holds bachelor's degrees or graduate or professional degrees, very, very highly educated. That compares to the rest of the US or even California, which have closer to 30%. So there's a lot of skill, there's a lot of immigration. Also, tremendous amounts of capital now flowing into the region. This region that used to be just prunes and apricots, and investment was reinvested from people's successes, has now generating, or rather, investments in 2015, like $27 billion of investment, okay? In 2000, it was almost 45. That was the end of the dot-com boom, and then there was a collapse. But you see now it's rising up again. So, and that's a huge amount of money that gets absorbed from all over the US and all over the world. And in fact, I think historically, this line shows that between 35 and 40% of all the venture capital invested in the US goes into this one small region in California, Silicon Valley. Okay, this illustrates how quickly things change. So the region was named Silicon Valley in the early years because of the ingredients in its main product, semiconductors. Today, nobody makes semiconductors in Silicon Valley. We still call it Silicon Valley, but we should call it Software Valley or Artificial Intelligence Valley or something different. But you can see, even as recently as 2002 and 3, software and biotech accounted for between 30 and 40% of all venture capital investments. I'm sorry, software and, sorry here. Semiconductors, networking equipment, and telecommunications accounted for about 40%. That has gone down to very little, 10% in 2015. So the hardware, the networking hardware, the telecommunications, the semiconductors have decreased dramatically, and software and biotech now account for about 60% of investments, venture capital investment. Just to show that this continues to evolve. It's a constant change in the region. The same thing happens in the financial ecosystem. So traditional venture capital emerged in the 70s, 80s, 90s. More recently, we've seen tremendous investment in what's called angel investment. This is often individuals investing in very early stage companies. So in 2015, this is like over $600 million, $700 million invested just by individuals into very, very early stage ventures, too early for venture capital. And this just shows that that kind of early stage investing has increased dramatically in the US in the last 10 years. So just a sign of the dynamism of the financial ecosystem in the region, as well as the technological evolution. Okay, I'm going to skip. This is just patent registrations, another way of showing how this thing keeps evolving and changing. Not only have patent registrations increased dramatically over the past 20 years, but again, they've changed. The composition has changed, and most recently, the majority is in information, data, computing, and communications. So the thing that's most striking is that on top of these tens or 20s of thousands of startups every year emerge, every decade, we see new global companies emerge. And these companies take advantage of that rich ecosystem of skill, of financial support, of know-how and knowledge that exchange very quickly within the region. So you see that, in 1970, there were 2 semiconductor companies. This is a semiconductor equipment manufacturer. In the 80s, we had Adobe, Oracle, Cisco, and Apple. So it's more computing and software. By 1990, we're seeing PayPal and eBay, which are e-commerce businesses, Salesforce, customer relation management, and then Google started that decade. Amazingly, to those of us that observe Silicon Valley, in the year 20,000, Tesla, that's a car company. Everybody thought Silicon Valley is technology, cars are in Detroit. But in fact, now we have cars being manufactured in the valley, and it's because the software that is the highest value-added part of the car, especially as the car becomes more autonomous and does more and more things on its own. Airbnb, again, a totally different business model than we would have seen in the 60s or 70s. Uber, social media, okay, very, very different technological and business model. And then finally, in the last decade, we're seeing data science, Internet of Things, more social media. I think the point I want to make here is that there's no technological trajectory. We used to think, okay, if I'm a developing country, I will do cars, and I will be able to follow these steps to do cars, or steel. Any product had a trajectory, and as you moved up the ladder, you could increasingly perfect production of cars or steel or cheese or dairy products or whatever. That no longer holds. Essentially what we're seeing now is that value is being added by new ways of solving many different problems and a blurring of the boundaries between firms. So, you know, is Tesla a software company, an artificial intelligence company, or a car company? Is Apple a communications company? It makes iPhones. Is it a phone company? Is it a, you know, I mean, the iPhone is like a supercomputer, but you can put it in your pocket. So the old industry boundaries that we thought divided industries are going away in this model. Uber is replacing taxis, Airbnb is replacing hotels, but their main value added comes from software. So over and over again, we're seeing sort of recombinations of skill, of software, of technology to solve problems, but it's sort of changing and continuing to evolve the capacities, and so there's no way to predict what will come next. And this is really an extension of this point I made earlier, that nobody planned Silicon Valley initially. There are a lot of capacities and capabilities that have accumulated over time, and those can be recombined, but nobody can predict what the next technology will be. So this chart shows decade after decade the sort of focus of technology. So early days it was really defense technologies for the military, then the integrated circuit, the personal computer, which looked like it was a direct technological sort of pathway, but then we got e-commerce and the web and the internet, and now we're seeing experimentation with mobile technologies, artificial intelligence, augmented reality, the cloud. No one of even the smartest entrepreneurs or investors in the Valley could have predicted the next wave. Okay, there are many, many cases of entrepreneurs being told about an innovation and saying, oh, that's ridiculous, that will never succeed. You know, the PC is snake oil, or nobody will buy a mobile phone. So essentially, this is a system that is emergent. It is not predictable in any way. The only thing we can say is that the value added continues to increase. So from decade to decade, as a product emerges and gets stabilized, some parts of production leave the valley. So for example, integrated circuits, some of the assembly went to Asia where there was cheap labor. Personal computers are being made mostly in Taiwan and China. A lot of the software that emerged in the 90s, the basic development is being done in regions in India. So it spins off lower value added activities, and what stays in the valley is the sort of the front end of innovation, new architectures, new products, new ideas. And it's only in hindsight that we can say, oh yeah, that made sense. That was predictable, but it really wasn't. Okay. So that's a brief overview of the Valley. in isolation. But of course, I just made points about how it's becoming part of a global economy. And, you know, in the 90s and the 2000s, the Valley became much more integrated into global value chains. I think that the information technology revolution that was created in Silicon Valley, in turn, enabled and required that companies pay attention, much more attention to what's going on outside of their own region, because new technologies can come from anywhere. I think, so you see firms, first of all, Silicon Valley firms locating offices, engineering labs all over the world because they're worried that something might come up there that they'll miss. They'll miss some key innovation. One of the most important mechanisms for Silicon Valley's globalization, historically, you know, you would think of a multinational simply putting a branch plant in other countries. One of the most important mechanisms is the rise of these diaspora networks, the networks of immigrants who come to Silicon Valley. They learn the model, they learn to work in Silicon Valley. I say they marinate in the Silicon Valley model. They understand entrepreneurship and venture capital and the whole ecosystem and how it works. And then they take those lessons back to their home country. So you find, you know, these networks of overseas Chinese or Indians or Israelis. Nobody paid attention to these in the 20th century, but suddenly in the past couple of decades, this has become a very important mechanism for sharing in a very decentralized ecosystem, for transferring knowledge, business models, technologies, identifying partners in distant places. You can see there are alumni associations. This is the Alumni Association of Tsinghua University. This is Monty Jade, is Taiwan's Technology Association. These are associations of immigrants who start in Silicon Valley, but then often they decide to go to their home country. And they build very important bridges linking Silicon Valley to their home country. One example that I've studied in great depth is the story of Taiwan, and I won't spend a lot of time on it, but in the 1960s and 1970s, Taiwan was a pretty poor region, low GDP per capita. In the 1980s, Taiwanese firms were basically imitating. They were reverse engineering personal computers and Macs. Then they began to do manufacturing for big US companies. So they would manufacture for HP or IBM, but their name wouldn't be on it. During this time, policymakers in Taiwan started to consult with them and ask them, so what's so special about Silicon Valley? What can we do to make our regions work? Over time, they reformed educational institutions. They reformed some of their research funding and their technology policy. And a decade later, you saw a huge flow of return entrepreneurs. So people who had spent maybe 10 or 15 years in Silicon Valley, in companies or in startups, they decided to go home. And, you know, a Taiwanese who returned to Taiwan not only could work better with the local policymakers and educators, they were their peers after all, but they also helped mobilize the local ecosystem. And by the 2000s, Taiwan had become the partner for Silicon Valley for manufacturing of high-end components, high-quality, low-cost systems, silicon foundries. Now, of course, this didn't last too long because Taiwan then moved into China. But if you look at products coming out of Silicon Valley today, what you see is, you know, a Taiwanese company, Foxconn, assembles the iPad. Chips come from Taiwanese companies, from Chinese companies, you know, from all over. So the global production network for an iPad or an iPhone now includes regions around the world. I'll quickly just show, this is the model that I think explains this the best, that in the past, multinationals would go to peripheral regions, to poor regions for cheap labor or maybe cheap land. So you could imagine that Silicon Valley was where the capital and the technology resided, and regions in Taiwan, India, China simply provided cheap labor. So it was fairly, you know, a core periphery relationship. I think over time, those relationships have become much more like two-way partnerships or collaborations where new product design, new architectures are developed in Silicon Valley, but the other region, whether it's Taiwan or Bangalore, become very good at what they do. They become the best in the world at manufacturing or at software. So this is a complementary specialization. So essentially, they go from being you know, peripheral to being partners to Silicon Valley and peers. And of course, once they become good at being partners to Silicon Valley, they can also be partners to other regions and to other producers in the world. So it's a mutual upgrading process that we've seen happen in a lot of formerly peripheral regions. Okay, let me talk quickly, I'm going on for a long time. Let me talk quickly about some lessons for policymakers. Okay. First lesson, there's no recipe. Okay, there are many potential recipes out there, but there is no recipe for growth. One recipe that I think we can all reject quickly is the idea of the Washington Consensus, that if we just remove trade barriers and minimize regulation, somehow growth will magically happen. I think this has been discredited, certainly in Latin America, if not elsewhere. Okay, oops, backwards. There's another recipe which is still out there. I can't believe it because it's been tried for decades and failed for decades, which is if you just get the ingredients right, you can grow Silicon Valley. And this involves, you know, a technology park, maybe an incubator, university research, venture capital, lots of engineers. And really, I've watched, since I've been studying Silicon Valley for decades, I've watched, you know, silicon pyramids, and, you know, every part of the world has tried to do something, and the mistake here is to mistake individual institutions or buildings in isolation as the source of innovation. But we know that the source of innovation is people, and people who understand businesses and can find new solutions. The most recent one in Moscow, Skolkovo Technology Park, just a couple of years ago, you may have followed this. They poured millions, billions of dollars into fancy buildings. Don't do that. It's a waste of time. There's also a recipe that was popular in the past decade, which is you can build a national innovation system. That at the national level, you can invest in either national champions, individual companies, or in some strategic sector. But if you were listening to what I said, nobody can know what the strategic sector will be. There is no way even the best policymaker or investor can know where technology goes. And my favorite example is Finland. Finland, for a couple of decades, looked like one of the most innovative parts of the global economy. They introduced very small, nicely designed cell phones, much nicer than the ones coming out of the US. And they started to mass produce them. And a lot of the scholars who looked at that said, wow, let's have a national innovation system. We'll pour money into engineers, we'll pour money into technology, and we'll make our own system. But what happened? Well, they focused so much on optimizing the manufacturing of these phones, lowering costs, getting their supply chains the best they could be, that they lost sight of innovation. So at the same time they were making the cheapest possible cell phones, Apple and Google were introducing internet, mobile internet, and, you know, GPS in phones and things. So they completely missed the technological changes and have really had a hard time recovering from that. Okay, lesson number 2. Differentiation and higher value added is the only way to compete in the global economy. Cost cutting, trying to optimize and, you know, sort of become the lowest cost producer is one easy way to undermine the ecosystem. When you're producing a commodity, you can't innovate. Commodity production means just lowering costs, and so the value added, it may have been in a mass production model where everybody was producing the same kind of cars that you could compete by lowering your costs. Today, competition only comes through higher value added and through innovation. So, you know, I think what you need to think about at a regional level is identifying what capabilities, what your distinctive capabilities are. What are the firm, the region, where are there markets for those products or services? I think this requires partnerships. It requires partnerships between firms and policymakers and universities and financiers. That this is, again, the conversations across the institutions are very, very important. In the old world, the university was an ivory tower, and everything happened inside it. It did research, and it threw its results out over the transom. Today, the university needs to collaborate with local producers, and policymakers need to understand what challenges firms are facing, and financiers need to help understand how to invest. So essentially, this is a process of iterating across and experimenting across the region. And just as firms can fail, you can start policy initiatives that fail. The lesson is that you try things and you measure the outcomes, and if they're not working, you stop. You have to just try lots of things because there's no guaranteed pathway to success. So I think, you know, investing in local capabilities, whether it's higher education or training, could be research on new processes, you know, new processes for cattle or dairy or technical assistance. Maybe it's export promotion, maybe it's, you know, IP production. There's no way that an outsider can know what a regional economy needs. It has to be the local community that defines what they need and defines what the challenges are. Why is it that we're having trouble? How can we overcome those obstacles? Okay, lesson number 3, connect globally. It's no region will succeed in isolation anymore. And the story I told before the lesson is that trying to replicate Silicon Valley in isolation will not work. But if you want to succeed, maybe connecting to places that are dynamic. Dynamic regions or firms that are in the industries that you want to participate in. So Taiwan and China and India connected to Silicon Valley. I'm not suggesting that, you know, that Rafaela should connect to Silicon Valley, but it probably should connect to regions where there are the most dynamic producers in industries that you have capabilities. Obviously, this includes a lot of external scanning. It requires, you know, lots of sort of exploration of potential partnerships that allow you to jointly solve shared problems. That could be partnerships between universities, between producers, between financiers, really almost any level. And I'll just underscore that the value, the way that the diaspora has helped in the Silicon Valley model, it's not simply that they took technology back to their home countries, it's also they helped policymakers define strategies that were more appropriate. They transferred best practice in terms of how to organize a firm, identified new markets, new partners, broker technology. In Taiwan, the diaspora, the returning overseas Chinese, helped create a venture capital industry in Taiwan. It required reforming the entire banking system and changing a lot of the laws. But that's, that's a useful exercise. And perhaps equally important is overcoming political opposition to reform. Most places that are having trouble with development are having trouble because the institutions get in the way. It's not because there isn't talent or technology. It's because there's kinds of institutions that want to stop reform. Maybe it's vested interests in old industries. Maybe it's people who are benefiting from the old regime, corruption, whatever. But often the diaspora can be used as a force to pressure change. Obviously, venture capital networks, connecting to venture capital networks is a very important piece of becoming global. And this is just, I have a couple examples. So Israel, Tel Aviv, and Bangalore, two regions that have really used their diaspora network to connect very successfully to Silicon Valley. Another example is Ireland, where foreign direct investment became the intermediary that allowed them to learn how to change in order to become more attractive for development. And then finally, I have an example of a failure. So all four of my grandparents are from Armenia. They all came in the early 20th century to the United States. So when I started doing research on Silicon Valley, I had a lot of calls and contacts from people in Armenia saying, okay, why don't you help us develop Armenia? And I knew from my parents' generation that they had poured, the diaspora had poured many millions of dollars into what they called the old country in order to help it develop. But the closer I got, and it wasn't that there weren't smart people, a lot of these kids, the smart students come to MIT, they do well in the US, but the closer I got to Armenia, the closer I realized that at the senior levels of policy, it was a deeply, deeply corrupt country. And there was no way, it would be a very big project. I couldn't certainly change the government and the political regime to make it a more open environment for investment. So I think that my lesson in how important institutions are came through Armenia. So my fourth lesson here is support institutional change. Technology, capital, skill, they're necessary, but they're not sufficient. You need to have institutions, whether it's transparent financial markets, competition, predictability. That's a problem here, I guess. But you need some kind of predictability, legal predictability, minimize, no place is free of corruption, but minimizing corruption is an important part of the story. And essentially what I'm suggesting as a package is what I would call open economy development policy. Your economy needs to stay open, companies stay open, create institutions that allow search and partnerships both locally and globally, building partnerships between private and public, understanding that your goals will change. Your goals will constantly change, so you cannot plan for 5 years. You can only plan for short term and be willing to take risks, be willing to try things that will fail. Just measure them and make sure that over time you learn and adapt, because there is no recipe. And the goal needs to be not big bang. I mean, people talk about development as a big bang, but this is an incremental process. It takes time, it accumulates lots of small steps over time that can create very important change. It's been 60 years in Silicon Valley. Really, after 30 years, they were doing well. But there are no overnight successes. This is just a process of learning and specializing and upgrading over time. And with that, I will stop and open up to questions.
Hola. Bien, aquellos que quieran preguntar, tal cual lo dijo la doctora Saxenian, Pueden hacerlo levantando la mano, cualquier consulta.
Here. Yeah. Well, thank you for your presentation. It was very clear, very interesting. And I have a question about, I haven't had the chance to see it by myself, but you of course have. What's your opinion about this East Coast and West Coast difference between MIT and Stanford? And does that make a difference or what?
My first book, which I published in 1994, was a comparison of Silicon Valley and the Boston Route 128 area. And essentially the book argued that Silicon Valley was outpacing the Boston area. At that time, the main industry was mini computers and then personal computers. And everybody who looked at it from the outside said, well, Boston has the big advantage because it has ties to Washington, D.C., established universities like MIT and Harvard, old industries, a lot of capital, and connections to the Department of Defense and whatnot. But in fact, Silicon Valley, I believe, was much advantaged because it was able to create a new culture. This culture I described, and this openness that allowed for a very different model of how people interact. So I think if you looked into the 90s and the 2000s, what you saw was that Silicon Valley outpaced on all the same industries, was way out ahead. I think since that time, so at that time there were big companies like DEC and Data General and Prime and Wang in Boston. They all collapsed. And now what you see is a new generation of startups around Cambridge, which are quite interesting, and I think look a lot more like Silicon Valley in biotech and software and whatnot. So I have a lot more optimism now for that region than I did. But I got my PhD at MIT, but I observed that Stanford, because it was, in its early days, it was kind of an outsider. They had to partner with the startups. So they were willing to work with small firms, whereas MIT in the early days only wanted to work with the big firms. And so that was really the kiss of death. Yeah. But if you want to read my book, it tells the whole story.
Oh. Yes, when you talk about the regional competitive strategies, you talk about the information flow, horizontal information flow. Do you refer only at a technical stage or about marketing,
everything.
management?
Yeah.
And do you think it's possible to reproduce this model in another regions with different entrepreneurial culture? It's possible.
I think it will always look different in other regions with different cultures. But I think that the habit of not talking about anything between companies, this sort of very secretive model, can change. And, in the early days, people would talk about, in Silicon Valley, they would say it was like gossip, because people would talk about who started what company, what technology did they try, where were they marketing, what was the process they were using, everything. And you would, you go to cafes or bars, and people talk. The only thing that doesn't get discussed is trade secrets, sort of very, your key to competitive success. So, I've been in Rafaela now 24 hours. I was here before. People are very open. They're very friendly. I think it's not that hard to imagine people. One parallel I would draw is that, if you're in a lab, an engineering lab, people share information pretty openly. You share ideas. So why can't you take that culture and bring it out into society? I think when I observe Asian societies, there's still more hierarchy. They don't like to be as flat. You're never going to change them completely. But I think that what we've seen now in Boston is it's become more like Silicon Valley. So I think a lot of parts of the US are becoming more horizontal and more open. So I think, these are just practices that get recreated over time, and things can change. People's behavior can change.
Here.
Here. Ah, yes.
Could you say a few words about Latin America? What are the biggest challenges that Latin America must face, or the asset of the opportunity that the region has?
I'm not the best person to answer that question, but just as an educated outsider, having not really studied it, I think the financial uncertainty and instability is a huge problem. I think, if continual devaluations and political uncertainty make it very, very hard. I think there's more corruption in Latin America than we would like to see. I think those are the kind of things. On the other hand, in Taiwan there was a lot of corruption, and there were old school actors who were, protecting their interests. So essentially those things can change, but it takes people really focusing. But, I probably could learn more from you about Latin America than you're going to learn from me about it. I certainly know that there's knowledge, there's know-how, there's expertise, there's resources here. So I think, I would say Latin America, there are certain connections between Latin America and the US, say the drug trade, Central America maybe. So some kinds of entrepreneurs are very successful. So, those networks, those are entrepreneurial networks. You could put them to good use as well as bad use.
How can you develop in your students the idea of process? Because we are used to getting results at once.
Yeah.
Yes? And having that idea of failure, yes, very soon,
yeah.
Yes, and being criticized. So you cannot go slowly from a point A to a point B.
Yeah.
Yes, is there anything that we can do as teachers or as educators, as anything, to improve that condition in the students?
Yeah, I think it's a very important piece of this picture. I think starting at very young ages, students need to understand that they can try things and fail. They can do projects, they can experiment, that, sometimes there are right answers, but sometimes you can find multiple ways to solve a problem. And they need to be empowered to try things and to experiment and not told that they're wrong. As they get older, I think there needs to be a lot of emphasis on teamwork, working on projects in teams, and projects that are real world. So doing things that are not just textbook, but doing things that actually are, they're making something that matters to the world. I would say pushing people to be, there's a whole thing about design thinking now, about thinking differently about designing things. And, I think that's an important kind of approach. I think design thinking, I think teamwork, I think just practicing being, in conversations where people don't say, no, that's wrong. Everybody, shares ideas and everybody listens and there are not bad ideas. I think so much of our education previously was, you're right, you're wrong,
Yes.
and that needs to change.
And perhaps reduce the importance of marks.
Yeah. Grades are just, they can be very
Yes.
destructive.
Yes, they prevent developing.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hola, mi pregunta es, teniendo en cuenta lo que usted habló de la importancia de... Acá. Teniendo en cuenta de lo que usted habló de la importancia de la inmigración y la diversidad cultural en Silicon Valley, ¿cómo hoy está afectando la política de Trump en relación a las leyes que quiere implementar de inmigratorias y si eso de algún modo pone en riesgo el modelo implementado hasta ahora en la región?
Oh, you mean national immigration policy? Yeah, I think that since 9/11 in the US, we have been less and less open to immigrants, and I think that's a very destructive thing. I think we should be opening our doors to people, especially people with skills. I'm very worried about Donald Trump, and because you know, 20 years ago, the US was known as a place where everyone was welcome. And now it feels like we're pushing people away. And I think that's very dangerous. Donald Trump worries me a lot on many, many dimensions.
Hello.
Hello.
What is your experience as a dean, as a researcher, and as an academic consultant at Apple regarding the relation between the academic field and the firms? Could you elaborate a little bit of that?
The academic field and?
The relation between the universities and the firms,
and
the
firms.
companies.
Yeah, yeah. They have their own role. So in the university, you want to be able to pursue research without having immediate product, immediate profitability. There are some companies now in the Bay Area that actually have research labs that look a lot like universities. They allow people to publish and whatnot. So it's blurring a little, but historically, you know, universities were a place where you didn't have to obey the profit line, the bottom line quickly. And I think what you're seeing, especially in the School of Information, School of Engineering, maybe in the business school, you're seeing more collaboration on problems, on joint problems. So for example, sometimes companies bring projects